1991, the Super Nintendo Entertainment Center was in its very infancy. Squaresoft had already released 3 Final Fantasy titles on the original Famicom, and the series was a smash hit. The first of the 3 took the Nintendo by storm in North America as well toward the end of its life. By this point, Final Fantasy was a huge, known commodity in the gaming world. With fans aching for more, Squaresoft eagerly adapted the series to a new era of gaming for the Super Nintendo, and thus Final Fantasy IV was born. This brought a whole new group of fans to the role-playing genre for the first time. It also set the course for the next generation of the Final Fantasy series, and captivated millions of gamers. As was usual by that time, series creator Hironobu Sakaguchi once again took the helm as director, determined to produce the best Final Fantasy game yet. Originally, the game was planned to be released on the Famicom, but delays in scheduling forced Square to bring it to the Super NES. The development team consisted of 14 individuals, and the game took about a year to complete. Among the design team was Hiroyuki Ito, who made his mark upon the game by developing the Active Time Battle System, or ATB. Under the new framework for combat, characters and enemies each had their own speed and associated meter that would determine the order of combat turns. This new apparatus would become a mainstay of role-playing games for years to come. In fact, it's almost impossible to overstate how influential this system was. And RPGs continue to use some form of ATB decades after it was originally created for this game by Ito. Not only did the ATB system cause players to have to plan better to formulate attacks based upon which characters go in which order, it also created better, interactive gameplay where the player always had to pay attention to what was going on. It can certainly be said that the ATB system did much to diminish combat monotony and keep the player's focus over the course of the game. The advent of the ATB system truly revolutionized role-playing games as we know them. There's just no other way to say it than that. Another big addition to the series after the platform change to the Super NES was new graphical technology, including Mode 7, a new system that allows visual background layers to be rotated and scaled quickly, creating a 3D-like effect. It may not seem too impressive of a feat now, but back then this was a huge advance in video gaming. Final Fantasy IV aptly uses Mode 7 to render the world map when traveling in an airship. Confusing some gamers is the fact that Final Fantasy IV came to North America as Final Fantasy II because North America didn't see the second and third title in the series. Right after starting the game, you launched directly into the game's story. This was yet another relatively new facet for Final Fantasy because in the previous games, you don't get very much background story at all in the beginning. You begin the game as Cecil, the Dark Lord captain of the Red Wings. The Red Wings are ordered by the King of Baron to attack the city of Mysidia, seize the water crystal, and bring it back to the kingdom. Cecil reluctantly carries out the orders, returning to Baron with the crystal after seizing it from those that guard it. There, he sees his love interest Rosa, who is a white mage. After bringing the crystal back, Cecil questions the king's motives and is stripped of his position as captain of the Red Wings. He is then sent with Kain, the captain of Baron's Dragoons, to deliver a ring to the village of Mist. At this point, the game's story truly begins, and you even receive a cool little storyline summary that frames the journey. Along the way, Cecil and Kain's paths diverge, but they eventually intertwine several times. Among the themes visited in the storyline are death, loyalty, friendship, and betrayal. As far as the story goes, I think it is generally very strong, especially for its time. The new Super Nintendo platform was a complete blessing for Final Fantasy. This was because it allowed for bigger storage, and thus the ability to hold much more dialogue and storyline segments. This is really what the first 3 Final Fantasies needed, but couldn't deliver on the NES platform. Game designer Takashi Tokita, who produced the original game, said the following on the subject in 2008. "It seems commonplace to have such epic storylines in RPGs now, but this was the first RPG to feature such deep characters and plot, so I'm truly happy." Indeed, one need only play one of the original NES Final Fantasy games, and then Final Fantasy IV, to see the stark contrast between storyline details. Final Fantasy IV was truly a big step forward in this regard, and a total advancement for the series. The main villain in the game is Golbez, a mysterious sorcerer who's trying to obtain all of the world's crystals to bring himself to the moon. Golbez is manipulative and cunning, and does much to cement his place in the series as the first complex antagonist in a Final Fantasy game. He really was the first Final Fantasy adversary with true character complexity. I think he's used very effectively in the story, and he brings a lot of intrigue to the game. At one point in the game, Cecil transforms from a Dark Knight into a Paladin, leaving behind his former Dark persona in favor of a nobler one. This was not the first time class evolution has been done in the series, but it is the first case in which it played a pivotal role in the storyline. As a wee young gamer, I remember how excited I was when Cecil's look and abilities had changed. I was even elated to see a different sword slice animation. There's just something cool and unique about the whole transition. Through these circumstances, the game explores the individual identity of the characters and their progression as people, something that had never really been done before in a role-playing game, let alone the series. I have to admit though, the end of the story in Final Fantasy IV gets a bit confusing and arbitrary. All of a sudden you're in a fantasy world doing things like slaying dragons and recruiting friends. Then you're confronting a colossal robot? Then you're sent to the moon and fly around on a giant whale? Huh? Also, the end boss of the game basically appears out of nowhere at the very end of the game. This was a unique twist, but there was little backstory on the creature to make it truly compelling. I didn't care about this much as a young player, but in hindsight, I feel it could have been handled a little bit better in the story. Even so, the storyline curveballs this game throws out at the player were surprising and interesting, unlike anything that had been done before in a Final Fantasy title. As far as difficulty goes, the North American version of the original game is quite a bit easier than some of the other games in the series. In fact, this decision was intentional, as the North American version was based off of the Japanese Final Fantasy IV Easy type, a simpler version of the game. Other changes were also made to the game to conform to Nintendo's strict standards for content, which includes removing all references to praying, and the spell Holy was even renamed to White. There is even one place in the game where a giant scythe that is about to fall onto Rosa is changed into a giant ball, as if the prospect of having one's head crushed is so much more palatable than being sliced. In accordance with these changes, some abilities were even taken out of the game. This included Rosa's Prey and Cecil's Dark Wave. These changes were unfortunate, especially the removal of the original abilities and the radical adjustment to the game's difficulty. However, I suppose the latter attracted more fans to the franchise than would have been gained otherwise. The game's music is another place where Final Fantasy IV excels. The soundtrack in the game was undoubtedly a huge step forward for the franchise. With the technical limitations of the original Nintendo now a thing of the past, famous Final Fantasy composer Nobuo Uematsu was able to push the boundaries of video game music with this game. Uematsu has publicly stated that creation of the soundtrack was an excruciating process. Accordingly, it involved long hours of work into the night at Squaresoft headquarters, where Uematsu would sometimes even stay overnight. I'd say that's dedication. In his liner notes for the Final Fantasy IV original soundtrack, Uematsu wrote the following, quote, "Since I was working with new hardware in the Super Famicom, the music was from start to finish a series of trials and errors, and the staff practically lived at the company, staying over in sleeping bags and doing nothing but working. I myself haven't had a full day off since February of last year." Appropriately, Uematsu signed the liner notes April 13th, 1991 at 1:30 a.m. in the office, naturally. With 44 total tracks in the game, Uematsu's use of the platform shined above all other RPGs to be released by that point. When this soundtrack was released, it seemed as if the skies were the limit for Uematsu and the possibilities for music in the future of the series. There are just so many standout tracks on this game, but among my favorites are the Theme of Love, the Overworld theme, the Red Wings, and the main theme for Final Fantasy IV. The game was eventually re-released on the PlayStation, the Game Boy Advance, the PlayStation Portable, and the Nintendo DS. There's also a version on Steam, so you can play the game on a PC. Each version of the game is quite different, but if you're looking for a recommendation for a version to play for the first time, I recommend the Game Boy Advance or PSP version. Between these two, I lean toward the PSP one because the graphics look beautiful, the sprites are awesome, and the translation is quite a bit superior to the original. The load times on the PlayStation version are quite annoying to deal with, and the Nintendo DS and Steam versions use a brand new graphics engine and 3D style that I do not like very much. But I will say many people do enjoy that version. It's not particularly bad, it's just a little bit too cartoony for my tastes. When Final Fantasy IV was first released, it was a commercial success, both in Japan and elsewhere. In Japan, 1.44 million copies of the game were sold, making it a huge hit for the era. By 2007, the game in all its forms had shipped about 3 million copies worldwide. At the time of its release, the game was met with lots of critical acclaim from gaming publications. Nintendo Power declared that it set a new standard of excellence for role-playing games. GamePro announced that it truly redefines the standards for fantasy adventure games. Electronic Gaming Monthly stated that Square has just redefined what the ultimate RPG should be. The game took a bit longer to catch on in North America, but its success was undoubtedly amplified by the release of Final Fantasy VI, which revolutionized the series yet again and brought many new fans to the older Final Fantasy games, including 4. Since then, the game has been included in many top video game of all time lists, and it's easy after playing this game to see why. And that will do it for my Final Fantasy IV retrospective and review. If you like this video, please subscribe and check out my other videos, and tell me what you enjoyed about Final Fantasy IV in the comments below.